Excellent. So we're live. So thank you very much for your time today. Appreciate it on this, what seems to be a very wet spring so far. I don't know if spring is setting us up for a very nice garden in June, but my grass has never looked quite so green. I'll leave that there. We've got a session around the new normal this afternoon, hosted really by Paul and Alistair. I know there's an awful lot of consideration as to what's happened that's got us to this point, but also what the impact is moving forward. With that, please put any questions you may have in the chat. Paul and Alistair will try and address those towards the end of the session. And with that, I shall hand over to yourself, if that's okay. Paul?
Okay, yes. Well, thanks for allowing us to come in and talk about or start some thinking about the new normal. We're starting from the viewpoint of whose ear do you have, looking rather more at the sort of human side of things. Alistair is going to start us off once I've managed to share the screen with some slides on it. So I can hand over to Alistair now.
Thank you, Paul. Workplace chaplaincy is based on the assumption that the world of work is a place for people. Rather obvious, but what is meant by that in all aspects of their lives? So, things at work will be affected by the individual's physical, mental, and emotional state, their relational life outside work, and those aspects of life which relate to meaning and purpose, which can arise from the broader belief systems they hold, whether these be spiritual, religious, or not. Chaplaincy simply seeks to provide a listening ear and support to people at work, in which all these things can find a place each and every day. The pandemic has severely affected what chaplaincy can do in support of the workplace. However, we have made great efforts to find new ways of ensuring that chaplaincy has been available, sometimes by embracing technology, sometimes with a much more personal touch. Now, we are wrestling with what it has all meant and what it will mean for businesses and individuals as we move into a different phase. The pandemic has transformed the world of work. A very, very big understatement. We now have to transition to a new normal, and that means serious and considered thought. From a Cambridgeshire workplace chaplaincy perspective, this means thought about how to help people deal with the loss they have experienced, and how to help with all those issues around the return to our working and workplace environments as we go forward. Thank you, Paul.
Thank you, Alistair. We've been thinking quite a bit with our chaplains, really, who have not, as Alistair said, been able to work in quite the way they did, but of how we're going to transition now into whatever this new normal may be, especially since it's not very obvious what it is going to be. The way that we've moved into this most is along the lines of loss that you see mentioned there. It's nearly 130,000 people have lost their lives. And so that's 130,000 families that have been subject to a severe bereavement. This has also inevitably impacted on people's health. The fact that there have also been a huge number of people who've had COVID, but not thankfully died, but have severely affected their lives, is again another loss on top of the loss of bereavement. But all of us have suffered other sorts of losses. So not being able to work in the way we did, restrictions on our freedom, no longer having the human contact we used to have, maybe not being in education as we were, not being able to do the usual things that we did for recreation, and that all of these are, in a sense, a sort of bereavement. And we do know from how people normally react to a bereavement, we understand some of the things that are likely to take place as a result of these losses that have been going on. From bereavement, we know that a number of things often happen. There's often a period of denial. People often inexplicably become angry over things through bereavement. There's clearly disorientation often takes place when faced with something happening. And then there's often eventually a sort of a resolution of it, although it never goes away. It's one of those things that is really neat in how it happens. These ideas that psychologists and so on have come up with are from observation, but they're not a strict pattern as such, but they are there. And often they can take on a bit of a cyclic form and a repetitive form, so that although it may appear to have been resolved, several years down the line, the impact of a bereavement can hit us again. The impact of any loss, particularly major ones, can hit us again. And so, without not having any obvious pattern, we've been having to try and think through how are we going to work with any of this? How are we going to manage it? And just some suggestions, really. These are very much off the top of the head things in a way from people's own experience. One is clearly to be aware that this is likely to happen. It's important to note the sort of losses that people have been through, that we ourselves are going through. I think this is one of the things which we do need to be aware of, and that is that we are all subject to loss through this pandemic. It is, as has been so often said, an unprecedented event. We've never had anything like this before in our lives. How are we going to be prepared for it? Well, we can't be really, but we need to recognize we are all in it, in a sense. And therefore we need to be aware and simply listen out for folk to see what they're saying, how they're feeling, and so on. It's also important to not be put off by what may be some powerful reactions by people, reactions of grief or reactions of anger or reactions of denial. Indeed, it's quite possible that some of the big social things we've been seeing happening, people denying that COVID exists, for instance, people being vaccine opposing, may be part of some of this sense of loss that's going on and bereavement. But it's important not to let that push us aside from trying to continue to live. And if people do react in these sorts of ways, certainly on a personal level, it's as well to give them a bit of space, as it were, but keep in touch, not retreat when people get a bit angry or whatever is causing them problems. It does mean it will take time for these things to be resolved as well. Recovery is not going to be overnight, no matter how much we might wish it would be. And I think we all wish it would be, but it is going to take time. I don't think at the moment anybody's got a very good handle on how long, but it will be. It's important, therefore, to be aware of that. It's important to encourage folk to talk about how they are feeling, to recognise that their losses, no matter how small, are things that matter. Certainly within the context of employers, employees, HR, and all the rest of it. It may be helpful to find ways of providing extra space where people can do that, can just talk a bit about what's going on, how they feel. I think one thing also that's going to be important is to not get caught up in any sort of euphoria about coming out of lockdown. I know I'm certainly looking forward to coming out of it and being able to travel a bit and stuff like that. And I think there is a bit of a danger that we might just get a bit too pumped up by those ideas and forget there are things that we're going to have to face and so on. And perhaps a sort of a final thing which is important is that we do need to make space for ourselves, whoever we are, to make space for us to be able to reflect on how we are feeling and how it's impacted on our value systems or our belief systems, if we have any. Actually, everybody's got some sort of belief system, even if it's a belief there isn't any belief. And those are the frameworks that undergird often a lot of what we're on about and how we live and how we make decisions and, and what our ethics are and so on. We'll all need a bit of help with that. I think everybody will need a bit of help with that. One of the things that we perhaps can all try and find, again, depending on our circumstances, is peer support, maybe from friends who will help us in this. If any folk go through non-managerial supervision, things like that, that can be tremendously helpful. Tremendously helpful sometimes, even in just knowing it's there if needed. In my last work, we had non-managerial supervision. It was very helpful. But one of the most important things I think the guy ever said to us was, make sure you've got someone that you can phone up at any time of the day or night and will simply listen to you. Who won't try and sort things out, but will listen, because you may well find you're going to be in a position where that's what you really need. Thankfully, I never needed it. But the thought it was there was actually really very helpful in a role that was a bit on the lonely side and could be quite stressful at times. So make space for ourselves is an important thing. Our own losses will need healing. There's no doubt about that. And it's as well that we recognise we might try and deny some of them and avoid doing that. I got ahead of myself there, really, didn't I? Sorry about that. The technology is running away with me. One other big issue that has come up, and is, I think you're dealing with this on another occasion, but we've had some initial thinking about this, is the notion of hybrid working and what that might mean. In some ways, it seems to have caught on as a could be a very good idea. Folk who are at home are enjoying being at home, enjoying working from home and not having to get up, travel, commute, not having the expenses of that, of being able to sit around in their pajamas, you know, but still work, etc., etc. And that can clearly have some, you know, some positive implications. Implications for employers too. Maybe savings on rent of buildings, rooms, and so on. Not having to provide equipment and things like that. All of it, you know, can have operational value and so on. In a recent CIPD piece of research, 40% of employers said they expect that more than half their workforce may want to work regularly from home after the pandemic has ended. Now, if that is so, that's really going to be quite an impact on the world of work. But there are some issues that we think need to be thought about before sort of rushing into that just a bit too quickly. One of the things is that there are considerable financial implications. Home working does mean increased costs. That's what I did for the last 17 years of my work. And that meant expenses on heating, lighting, and all the rest of it, which, if you're self-employed, there are income tax benefits that can come with that. But if you're employed, how does that going to work out? Is the employer going to cover costs like that? In which case, that becomes then taxable. So there are sort of financial things that float around that are maybe not be quite so straightforward, may need a bit of thinking about. The overall effects of working at home, it can be good, but social interaction within a group of people in an office can often have a bit of a buzz about it, can be a place where team working can get generated, where ideas are often stimulated by other people, simply being with them. And it isn't just a case of being able to do it all on Zoom. There is also the issue of general well-being. Different personality types cope better in different situations. People who tend to be introverted, happy to be on their own, get a lot of energy from being on their own. People who are more on the extrovert side of things need to be in touch with other people, and not, again, in touch means being present with, in order to get some energy. If they don't, then they're the people who start crawling up the walls because somehow things aren't what they need to be. A certain amount of thought needs to be given to the implications of a more hybrid version of working, depending on people's actual personality types and their own personal needs. There's also the issue of sort of stress and fatigue. I think it's fairly well known that you don't want to be on Zoom for too long at any one time. It sort of tends to addle the brain a little bit. There is a sense of fatigue that easily comes in. But it's worth bearing in mind that lots of changes in life and lifestyle all have some sort of stress attached to them. There's a thing called the social readjustment rating scale that many years ago, a couple of guys called Holmes and Ryer developed, which drew on the idea that there is stress in all sorts of situations, so that they did a scale based on 100 points, as it were, went for the death of a spouse. That's the most stressful thing that might happen. And they then worked out different levels of stress for different things, right the way down to Christmas, which you think, well, that's a good thing, but actually there is a level of stress involved in that. And if you begin to think in those terms, all the different stresses people have had during the pandemic and will have in coming out of it, you begin to add them up and you see, hang on, there could be a problem. Because the more stress we have as individuals, then the more likely we are to find ourselves in some sort of unhealthy situation. And so in this mental health week at the moment we're in, it's worth just thinking and reflecting on that, because it encourages us to proceed with care at the moment. Even folk who are self-employed have probably been doing a lot of the alone stuff for quite a while, but even they will have been and will continue to be impacted by the different stresses and so on that have been going around. Really, one of the things we would want to say from our own viewpoint, and from the viewpoint of, as it were, sort of stroke inverted commas professional chaplaincy, is to listen. This is why we started this thing off by calling it Whose Ear Do You Have? Because each of us does need to have a place where we can actually just speak and just let our thoughts be shared. And it doesn't, this is a particular issue again for folk who are self-employed if they're not in touch with groups of people. And if we can make sure we've got someone somewhere who can be there when we need to speak and just share what's going on inside of us, we will find this a great help. One of the problems that I think people tend to feel, whether this is a British thing or not, I don't know, is that we feel, we don't want to say anything too much about ourselves until it's really urgent. And so then we'll phone the Samaritans because we're fearful that we're on suicide watch. Really, if we can get to a place where we're willing to just chat about how we're feeling before ever we get anywhere near that particular scenario, we will be a lot better off. It's not that we have to be in great distress to need a friendly listener. In many ways, that's a normal, natural thing that will happen in family life and in community life. But of course, that's the very thing we've been deprived of recently. And therefore, there will be, if you like, something of a backlog building up of some of the stresses that might get to us. So really, what we want to say is that it's a good thing to get someone who's going to be able to listen to you. And that one of the things that CWC has developed, or two things that we've developed during the pandemic to try and help this, has been that we do have a sort of a listening service. And it is meant to be a listening service. It's not meant to be sort of heavy duty stuff, if you like. It's just meant to be there when people want to just have a chat and work things through a bit. Sometimes all it needs in a conversation to help us through a problem is to just see it in a different perspective, to get someone else's view, as it were, to reframe it in a slightly different way that helps us get a grip on it. So it's no longer a thing that bounces around in our heads and keeps causing us distress, but has become something we put in a frame and we know what we're going to be dealing with. The other thing that, and that's available to folk by be on our website and get a message through and someone will be available. But also we developed the Workplace Wellbeing Hub, which is simply a website with an awful lot of information about health, about mental health, and about the other issues relating to belief systems, which is there for people to explore for themselves. So they'll find videos up there, they'll find pieces of writing up there. Hopefully, sort of pick and mixing that will have something that will help folk in our workplaces to navigate what we're having to navigate at the moment. So, in a sense, we finish by saying, well, whose ear do you have on a personal level? Or what about your employees, if you've got any? Or what about your friends and so on, if they, because it is an important thing we believe to do as we transition out of the lockdown. Okay, I don't know if Alistair's got anything he wants to add to all that before. If you have any brilliant questions, then Alistair will answer them and I'll sit here. But we'll try, and if there are any or comments folk may have, that will be great to hear as well.
Awesome. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Alistair. I'll open the questions if that's okay. A lot of people, and it's certainly coming from sort of a manager background, it's often very difficult to be the listening ear and be trusted by your employees, that there's no retribution, or you're not going to think overly negative thoughts about them as a result of them being open and transparent. And I'll give you a scenario. I've got a friend at the moment who lives down in London, and he's, believe it or not, he's in the middle of a very stressful situation in that they're a software company. Their software is built in India. Currently, 1 in 8 people within the organization that's based in India is suffering from COVID. That's before you get near those that are impacted by families and various other things. So their software is not progressing. There are bugs that are not being fixed, and there are customers that are getting very irate. And he's sat in the middle. And essentially, he can't go to his employers and say, this is stressing me out, because they will, subsequently put him on stress leave, and that's a black mark against his employment. But at the same time, needs somewhere within that organization to be able to express himself. What do you have any thoughts around that? Because that feels to me as though quite a challenging scenario that a lot of employers probably have.
Yeah, I mean, Alistair may want to join in. I think, yes, it is a very challenging scenario. I think, and even large companies that have large HR departments, there's still an issue there, because it's still company, as it when it can still be a problem. In a sense, this is where things like CWC might come in, or, if not us, then people like Mind, for instance, in terms of mental health, they will have listening services as well that can be accessed freely and anonymously, so that there's none of that problem about will this get back to anybody, and that that to me is what you need. You need an independent body, if you like, who is sympathetic and understanding, and who's got no reporting back to do, but will be able to listen, which often is the most important thing, but hopefully point to particular resources, if there are resources that are going to be needed to help in a situation like that. I mean, that particular situation you're talking about, it strikes me that the guy could do with someone he can just talk to every now and again as it all works through, to help him process what sounds like a really full-on stressful situation.
Yeah, completely. And it's more stressful because he's targeted against, customer acquisition. And if customers are leaving because product's not ready, well, what do you do in that situation? So it is. I think the third party perspective, I agree with you there. I think it's easier to open up to a third party that's got no kind of investment in your well-being. And by that, what I mean is that it's not going to loop back to the employer. So, but typically speaking, this strikes me that one of the points that you brought up in the presentation kind of hit home, which is when you look at the sort of grief curves, and psychology has different approaches to this, as you outlined. essentially, though, it's never a one size fits all, and things bubble up many years down the line for no reason. But also, actually, I'm going to argue that we exist in that grief curve pretty much infinitum.
Mm.
And by that, you deal with the initial loss. There's a study going on at the moment that suggests that losing a loved one that's close to you is almost akin to brain damage, because the neuroplasticity of the brain has got to rewire different habits and processes. But essentially, you're once you've dealt with that initial grief, you're still in that cyclical grief. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think you're right in that. I think so often we tend to separate mind, body, and spirit, for that matter, and forget actually it's all one whole. So anything that affects you emotionally has already affected you physically, because there's physical stuff, as you said, going on in your brain. Neurochemicals are whizzing around, connections are being made. So yeah, I think it's probably more not the grief curve is a thing, but I think the stress issue is the one that we are living in all of the time. You know, even the smallest of changes actually adds a little bit of stress to things. I mean, you can find that in groups. If you introduce a bit of change into a group setting, that group, the anxiety levels start going up quite quickly. And with that, obviously, therefore, there is stress as well. Yeah, I think in a way, in a sense, we are all familiar with this, but we're not familiar with it in a sense, in as much as we haven't perhaps, delineated it. And that, in a sense, what we're trying to do is just put it out there a bit so that people can perhaps begin to interpret a little bit more what's happening to them and how they cope with it in ways that will help them cope with whatever's coming along in the future.
That's a great point. In that self-regulation and self-awareness is hugely important in these situations. Are there tools or thoughts that you typically help people understand where they're at by going through this? Hang on, I'll just stand back for myself from a second, assess what's happening, and then that then gives me a little bit of clarity into the situation. Do you have those sort of tools or processes that help people on that journey, or is it a personal discovery journey for the individual?
That's a very good question. I mean, there's a huge industry in self-help. You know, you go to a bookshop, masses of them, all from all sorts of different perspectives. I mean, I'm not familiar enough with all of that to make many judgments about it, but certainly in terms of my own experience, in terms of having been a minister and working pastorally with people, and also my own personal experience, it is the opportunity, really find someone to talk to about it in a way. It gives you, getting it out from your head gives that little bit of distance to whatever's going on in your head, for you to see it that bit more clearly and begin to manage it a bit more effectively. And as I said, I mean, in a good marriage, spouses do this for one another all the time, in a sense. It's just that sometimes in situations, well, back to your original question, Ollie, where things may get back and you're worried about that, finding some situation, some person who will confidentially just be the sounding board is often going to be a way in which a person will discover themselves what they can do, what will manage, what will help. A quick example of that was just chatting with somebody yesterday who's had some disappointments in some work they've been developing, and was just sharing what they were thinking about it. And as it went through, he mentioned some people who'd been engaged with him in this, but he hadn't actually talked to them about the disappointments and the frustrations. And the sudden thought that we brought into the conversation, well, here's a wider group that you might connect into again and see where they are and what they're thinking. And that, Tim, suddenly was a little bit like a light going on. Oh yeah, that's a way that I can share some of these things and find out the reality of them, find out the substance of them by seeing how they're viewed by others.
it's an interesting one. One of the things that I read about this many years ago, which is as well as part of that sort of that grief curve as well, is the in a relationship you have this thing called distributed memory.
Mhm.
Distributed memory is that collectively as a whole you know everything that's going on, but you are the sum of the two parts typically. And I'll give you an example of that. I don't know what time the children get picked up from school and from where. As an example, these are just sound bites that get out there. So actually in that scenario where families split or a partner dies, the other partner suddenly has half a life to try and figure out that's not available. And I was privy to a conversation probably 15 years ago, which was shocking at the time, where somebody quite elderly had lost their wife. And when asked, would you like a cup of tea? The answer was yes. To which the subsequent answer, question is, would you like milk and sugar? The answer was, yeah, I have milk, but I don't know how many sugars I have or if I have sugar at all, because my wife always made the tea.
Mm.
Now that whole process is incredibly stressful to go through in itself. But yet when we start to apply this back to, you know, certainly families that have been impacted by COVID, they've suddenly got this huge void that needs to be filled. They've got questions around who's going to look after children while I work. But then on top of that as well, you've got people that right now coming out of lockdown are finding it really anxious. Do I want to go back to the workplace? Do I want to get on the underground? You know, because as with any form of agoraphobia or that, you know, those sort of issues, the longer it goes on for, the harder it becomes, right?
Yeah. Yes.
So it strikes me that there's going to be a lot of employers that basically are going to be sat there with employees that are uncomfortable in those situations and would like to voice their concerns, whether it's mental health or whether it's the opportunity to become infected by something like COVID themselves, right?
Someone described it to me as back to listening again. It's just like they said, discerning what is pre-pandemic and discerning about the new normal and making decisions based on those two parameters and being very focused about it. And you know, you're right, Ollie. There is a huge concern from people about actually physically getting out of their four walls, which they've been very comfortable in, or most people have been very comfortable in for a long period of time, and now going out into the world, and that in itself, just that one thing, is a big stress.
And of course, it's changed to routine as well now, isn't it? So the habits need to be broken, new habits need to be formed. Again, that's stressful. But also from an employer perspective, you have to be mindful that, you know, maybe this is something that has to be staged over a period in time, in the same way that going into lockdown was, you know, it was a graduation, wasn't it, from sort of March through to May time.
Yeah.
So does anybody else on the call have anything they'd like to share, or any questions they would like to ask while we have Paul and Alistair on the call? Shall I apply the standard 5-second Zoom rule if you can't get off mute within 5 seconds? So on that basis, if there is any employers on the call right now that are sitting there thinking, well, actually, this is a big concern for me because the new normal will be interpreted differently based on a business. It's not a one size fits all. Some people need to be office based, some people need to be workplace based, others can work from home. If they are concerned about this and want to give their employees a voice to be able to reach out to a third party, such as yourselves, how do you typically engage with businesses or individuals in that scenario?
I'm not sure there's a typical way, in a sense. For instance, if one of our, you know, if there's a chaplain based in a particular setting, they will be the person, hopefully, that folk could use as not quite a mediator, but someone who could hold the ring in a sense of, and might make suggestions and might help enable that sort of conversation to go ahead. I mean, I guess it depends a bit on the size of the business and as well. I mean, again, a company that's got an HR department hopefully will be sensible enough to set something up, because if you don't bear in mind all the issues that people have been facing, it will come out to the detriment of the company at some point. This has to be managed. In some ways, one of my greatest fears is the sort of the post-COVID euphoria that might set in. That people think, oh, great, we can rush off, you know, and it will be okay. That would be disastrous, I think, because you can't buck the people and their mental state, their health state, and all the rest of it, and you have to go with it. So that would be, you know, if they've got a chaplain, then that will be a person who might do it. I guess if folk were interested in going further, they could simply contact us, you know, within the Cambridgeshire, Peterborough and Cambridgeshire network, and we would try and provide someone to sort of walk alongside, if you like, and help think it through a little bit. That can be done. There are probably professional organisations as well that you could relate to. Alistair might have a little bit more idea about that. I think CIPD might be a body that could help. Alistair, have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree with you, Paul. It's there are other organisations, and I think there are a number here joining us today who have professional organisations with who will be able to help, of course. I think it's also important to remember that change can be very good for companies, good for individuals. And as we were talking to a major retailer the other day, he said one shouldn't be frightened off by this new normal. There are good possibilities from it. You know, growth can come from this, and as is being demonstrated by the way that our economy seems to be getting back into gear quite quickly. And so we being very cognizant of all the problems that are inevitably going to happen, and the difficulties that we're going to have to engage with in the future, as we've been talking about, particularly with the mental health of individuals and the way that we're working, being able to work with them. It's very important to remember that we are a positive race of, you know, and we do get on with things, and we do try to make things work. And what we're doing here is trying to help make those things work in the most comprehensively good way that we can.
So it's a great point, Alistair. I don't know if anybody's done any studies on the measurement of change. As in, there must be sort of a point where, you know, on the curve where there's diminishing returns in terms of stress, the more change you pile upon somebody. and COVID has resulted in an awful lot of change. So adding, you know, another 5% to that stack, what does that mean in terms of thinking about the workplace of the future? But actually as well, I think the most important piece to this puzzle, and again, you know, as an employee, you need to think this through, which is it's your job to set the kind of rules of engagement. It's your job to make the parallels that people can walk within. Because once you've done that, people just execute. They no longer feel insecure about, you know, what's the direction, where are we going, and what's happening. Back to your point, Paul, I think one of the most destructive things that can happen now is that everybody rushes back out and we end up in lockdown again in 3 or 6 months' time, right? Purely and simply because you know, being given that element of freedom and then having that taken away again is going to be quite painful, I think.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's also very important to remember that we will be moving into an era of different working practices, and it's very experimental. You know, no one has been able to do this forever in the past. It's always been possible for people to work from home. Employers have always recognised that it's possible for people to work from home, but COVID has brought this forward in a really big way, and so it's now become, if you like, I'm not liking this expression, the new normal, and it will go on to being the new normal. And therefore, everyone, going back to Paul's point, you know, our point about listening, employers will have to listen to employees, and you will have to be very much more proactive with that listening, so that you understand each other, and you have to allow doors to be opened. Like, for example, you know, we are very reluctant to talk about our mental health from the point you were making, Ollie, about that poor chap who's having that awful amount of stress. Now that should just be off. You know, there should be no limits to the way that people are able to talk to each other. And if it means you're talking to your employer about serious stress issues, serious mental health issues, that should be able to happen. And the employer has to actually allow that to happen by being so clear that there are no shut doors in this conversation.
Yeah, completely. And the most frustrating piece about that particular conversation is it's not because that he's not a flawless executor and also highly experienced individual. So if you were to go and hire, there are very few people that you would be able to replace him with that would do a better job. So yeah. That's not somebody, that's not talent you want to lose either. You touch on a point there though, Alistair, which is, when we start to look at the working from home, this is something personally I've done for many years. I worked for a large tech company, and we worked from home for 7 years before doing what I'm doing today. And in fact, I either worked from home or I was traveling. That's pretty much how that worked. However, they had the luxury of deep pockets and could understand how that needed to work for individuals. A lot of businesses don't have that privilege in a lot of regards. But the last study that I read is that digital transformation has accelerated 10 years as a result of COVID. What's quite funny about this is that Zoom is a technology I've used for 5-6 years. Zoom's been around for over a decade now. Pre-COVID, a Zoom call was lots and lots of names on a screen, and you only ever shared desktops. Nobody was on camera. Post-COVID or during COVID, the camera got switched on. So that was the big flip, if you like, in terms of that differentiation. But I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that we're lucky in a lot of respects that we have the networks that are just about available now to make this happen. If this happened a decade ago, it would have looked awfully different to what it looks like today, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was very different.
Yeah. I think it's worth making the point too that taking the time to think this through, taking the time to work out what will be best for employees, etc., is in the interests of the business. Because otherwise, if people start cracking up and so on, if your friend, for instance, as you said, he couldn't be replaced. So if he gets to the stage where it is too much and he has to step back out of work for a while, if his health, and it wouldn't necessarily be mental health. I mean, quite the stress things can affect, our immune system. So it may be, you catch something nasty or whatever, and he was then out of the picture, then the company's in trouble. I think it really is in the interests of companies to take note of the wider needs, as it were, of their employees and how that will be managed moving out of the pandemic. It really is. It's not being, it's not soft soaping. It's not, just being pandering to people. It actually is in the interest of the business.
Do you believe that's a top-down cultural change as well, in that, leaders within the organization need to be able to express their true selves first in order for employees to follow. And again, I'll give you an example. The CEO that I used to work for, the business was in, quite stressful buyout. What's happening? Are we being diluted? Are we being absorbed? There was all these conversations. And he openly said in a meeting, he turned around and said to us, there was a group of us in a meeting, and he said, my wife's telling me that I'm, like a bear with a sore head to live with at the moment. And I suddenly stopped and thought, actually, you know what? When your wife tells you that, you need to stop and rethink what you're doing. And he was talking us through this whole process. And that's somebody as a business leader that's comfortable expressing, their personal life and the challenges that they've got in their personal life in a workplace environment, which encouraged employees to also divulge what was happening. Do you see that as being, an obvious first step for most businesses, is, that top-down approach?
Yeah, if I could answer that one, I totally agree with that. I had a copy of an email from a senior director of a very large organization to his employees, and he listed all the ways in which the pandemic had affected him. Stress, anxiety, loss of confidence, health issues, fatigue, and many more, listed them. And I just thought that was a really good thing to do, because it enabled and now enables their employees. It's opened the door, frankly, from a subject which is normally completely taboo. He set the example, and I thought that was a great thing to do.
Yeah, and it strikes me that when you sort of start a revolution, because that's really what that is. It's not an evolution of the workplace. This is a revolution around mental health and the fact that we all suffer from it. All of a sudden, there's, not a tidal wave effect, but certainly people feel more compelled to express themselves. I was talking to somebody last year who said that primarily they were sort of finding that they were speaking to more CEOs than anybody else in terms of support from a third party perspective than ever before. Because during COVID last year, actually, if you're running a business, it's an incredibly stressful situation, because you have to forge the path upon which everybody walks, right? You are looked at as the source of security when it comes to things like wages. So I thought that was kind of interesting that from a third-party mental health perspective, they'd seen this huge rise in senior leadership having to reach out, and hopefully that's the start of that change, right?
Well, as we discussed before at some of these sessions, the self-employed, the employers, the business owners, it's how you're made, isn't it? You are made in a particular way, usually, which means that you are very self-reliant, and you don't give away much about your own personal concerns, and perhaps, using the word that isn't usually allowed nowadays, your own personal weaknesses in public, and being open about them. And it's a culture that we all have had. I mean, I've run and continue to run business, two little small businesses now, but they were large at one time. And that's exactly what you do, is you do not admit to these kind of usual, normal human characteristics in certain circumstances.
Yeah, agreed. And the point that you said there about weaknesses is, again, that's how these things are interpreted, right? But ultimately, unless you are quite high up on the Bob Hare, psychopathy scale, you are going to experience quite a lot of emotions, and that's entirely normal. I remember reading an interview with the CEO of BP during Deepwater Horizon, And I think the ending of it, and I can't quite paraphrase it, but essentially it was, imagine spending 3 months of your life where every waking hour you're being sued, every sleeping hour there are protesters outside of your house, right? Ultimately, I just want my life back. And that was a massive, paragraph to read, because that was really him saying that actually, you know what, didn't predict this. And ultimately I'm having to weather the storm. But you think about COVID, pretty much every business leader was in that situation last year, especially in hospitality and those sort of sectors, right?
Yep, you're right, Ollie. And I spoke to someone else the other day who has a comfortable armchair in his living room, and he had to make a very serious decision about closing down some businesses. Now he can't sit in that armchair anymore. In fact, he finds it very hard to go into that room. And this is a senior person in a very large organization. And, you think would be totally and completely resilient. And we are, none of us are totally and completely resilient, like you were saying.
And that also is an illustration of where there may be problems about home working. That when home and office, as it were, or work are separate, then when you come home, you've left the work. When you're at work, you left the home. But when the two intermingle, you can find some real difficulties. And that's a very extreme one, but it was a very extreme circumstance that guy was in, a traumatic one, in fact, which is effectively what's happened there. He's had a traumatic effect that has affected, being able to walk into a room. I mean, that's pretty dire, really. But that's another reminder about there's a lot to think through when we move into whatever the new normal is going to be.
I'm smiling because I have a door on my office in my house, and it's quite uplifting to walk through the door and close it behind you. Because ultimately every day has felt a little bit like Groundhog for the last 12 months. With that, gentlemen, I really appreciate your time, and thank you very much for sharing your knowledge on this session. For anybody that wants to reach out, obviously, workplacewellbeing.org.uk would be a great start on Mind. And likewise, we've recorded the session today, so we can distribute that around to make sure that everybody's got that. And yeah, just like to thank you very much again for your time. Is there anything you'd like to say to close out the session?
Just, well, from my view, thank you for letting us come and share in this way, and we hope it's been helpful and useful.
And likewise, thank you, Ollie. Thank you.
No problems at all. And thank you everyone for attending. Alistair, a pleasure as always. I know we've spoken and chatted quite a bit through the last year on Zoom. Maybe one day we could go for a coffee. It's not quite the new normal, is it? That's back to tradition, but there we go. Excellent. Yeah. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Have a good rest of your day. And thank you to everyone that joined the call.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.